This is Access Ann Arbor.
Hi, my name is Zarina Elamine Naeem, and I'm the Community Engagement Liaison for University of Michigan's Museum of Natural Understanding Race Project. Now, today we are here with the Ann Arbor Public Library and the Ypsi Public Library's book, The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander. We are partnering on their 2013 Ann Arbor Ypsi Reads. And this discussion today is about mass incarceration in the era of color blindness. The Understanding Race Project is bringing in an exhibit called Race, Are We So Different? It will be at the Museum of Natural History from February until May of 2013. You're invited to come down and see that. So I have three panelists with me here today. I have LaRon Williams, who's a storyteller and community activist, popular in the community with infusing racial tones and history within his stories. We have Ms. Cassie Stanzler, who is a U of M student and active with the Students Organizing Against Prisons. And we have Ms. Barbara Claver, who is an English teacher at Pioneer High School. So welcome to you all. Thank you all for coming. Okay, so we're talking about mass incarceration in the era of color blindness. And Michelle Alexander tells us that in the last 30 years, our penal system has grown from around 300,000 people to over 2 million today. That's a quadruple jump from 300,000 to over 2 million today. And that the war on drugs has been the largest increase, has accounted for the largest increase in this jump. Now, this war on drugs is not waged everywhere in the United States. It's waged primarily in poor communities of color, and African American men are the largest number who are being convicted and incarcerated. So Alexander says in her introduction, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of the educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and the exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. Now, my question to you all is, many of us knew this information sort of in our minds. We had an idea that this was going on, mass incarceration. A lot of them are African American young men, but we didn't know it sort of intimately and deeply. And so Cassie, you know, as a student at U of M and your upbringing, did you know this information, or was it new information presented by Alexander to you?
I feel like even just most recently, in like the 4 years I've been at Michigan, I think about how this system has prevented people who have been targeted by the criminal justice system from even getting there in the first place. So it feels to me like it's newer information than I'm sure it is for a lot of people, solely because the place where I live and where I'm educated is sort of guarded by some of the things that Michelle Alexander talks about, where people who are incarcerated or people with felony convictions are excluded from these institutions. So I wasn't seeing it as explicitly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And LaRon, what about you? You know, she mentions African American men are the largest target of this war on drugs. Were you aware of this information, or did it come? Is it new for you?
I'll tell you, the feeling of it being out there was not new. You know, being kind of in the midst of it, and seeing it around me wasn't new. But the way that she put the information together, the way that she drew a historical context for understanding it, and in a sense of the severity of it and how widespread it actually is, those things were new. I didn't have that I'll call it umbrella vision, you know, where I was looking at it as a wholesale thing. I just saw there was a lot of stuff going on, but I would not have been able to explain it the way that she did. And that's even with thinking systemically, which I do, you know, and seeing how things show up in different systems, I still wasn't making the kind of connections that she makes in the book.
And so, you know, she talks about mass incarceration as a system of racial control. And it's not just crime control as it's put out to be, that this is controlling crime, but it's a system of racial control. And Barbara, with this system of racial control and your own experiences and understanding of the world as it is today, how was your what was your reaction to the information Alexander presented?
Well, I really resonated with the Cornel West quote that said, too many people are well adjusted to injustice. And I think that that's true of my students as well. But I also think that it's shocking to me that the idea of a felon is not just a violent criminal. When people hear felons, I think they think someone who's committed a violent crime, as opposed to someone who has had in possession a small amount of some kind of illegal drug, or sold a small amount of some kind of illegal drug. It shocked me that the United States has, what, 6 to 10 times any other industrialized nation percentage of its people in prisons.
Yeah, and let's talk about that for a moment, because with that huge increase, this number of 2 million people, and the war on drugs being the largest contributor to that increase. Now, you could say that is the war on drugs the most important issue of crime that the United States needed to address. Alexander even talks about drunk driving and the fact that drunk driving kills many more people than this small amount of marijuana. Yet if you're convicted of drug driving, or you get caught and arrested for drug driving, you can spend as little as 2 to 10 days in jail. You know, you get out, you may have to pay a fine, and you could have really hurt someone's life. Now, I'm smoking a joint. I don't smoke joints, but I have a small amount of marijuana on me, and I could end up in jail for a minimum 3 to 5 years and have my entire life shifted. So, Laron, this whole notion of once you're a felon, that comes with stigma, that comes with discrimination. What are your thoughts about the afterlife of being a felon?
It's rough. I mean, yeah, you're right. She not only is very explicit about the whole process of how the war on drugs is targeted primarily to Black and brown communities, that the war on drugs is a tool. I mentioned context earlier, and she's very good about establishing the context between historical forms of racialized social control and the mass incarceration as a form of racialized social control. And so she's very good with showing us the parallels between how the war on drugs as a tool is being used contemporarily in the same way that other tools have been used to maintain a kind of a racial caste system. So yeah, once you're stigmatized, and she also is careful to point out that it isn't simply whether you actually do jail time that matters, it's the label of having been a felon that matters most. So once you're stigmatized with that label, then all these other things kick in. And one of the things is that sense of shame, the stigma, trying to return to a community that ostracizes you, trying to return to a community where there are all sorts of ways that it's difficult to find housing, difficult to find employment. So things just kind of compound once you've been attached with that that label of felon.
And Michelle says, as a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. And so when we talk about the large numbers of African American young men, primarily in the height of their life, they're young, this is the time when they should be going to school, this is the time when they should be building families, yet they're entering into this system, and when they get out, they're labeled a felon, they're discriminated against within housing, within employment, they have to check the box for the felony record, and that can bar them from tons of opportunities in life. Now, looking at our society here, sometimes those young men are invisible to us, and we have not necessarily realized that this system grew from 300,000 people to over 2 million. And we sort of say, okay, well, he's a felon. You know, he deserves it. He did something that he shouldn't have done. He went to jail, bam, like that's it. And we don't necessarily think about all of the permanent ramifications that come with it. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about why it is that we seem to be apathetic a little bit to other people's plights that maybe have not hit us personally yet, and how it is that we allowed this system to grow from 300,000 to 2 million people, where now the United States is the largest incarcerator of their ethnic and racial minorities than any other country in the world. So Cassie, what do you think about the fact that we have been sort of silent to this growth of and the creation of mass incarceration?
I think it has to do with the quote that Barbara brought up in the introduction about sort of becoming accustomed to injustice, I believe that's how it was phrased. But the idea that once someone does one thing, we find it easy to let that become their entire sort of identity and self. So a felon or a criminal, that identifier almost sort of floats above, as an umbrella above all of your other qualities. And I think that allows things like the box on job applications saying, are you a felon, to exist, because the idea is that if you have committed one crime, that somehow that might disqualify you when everything else in your life could qualify you for a job or something.
Right. And then, go ahead, Laurent.
Well, also, it isn't like it's anything new. I mean, again, I think that she does a very good job of showing historical parallels. So, you know, she goes from slavery as a form of mass racialized social control to Jim Crow as a system of mass socialized racial control to the new Jim Crow or mass incarceration as a mass system of social control. And at each one of those stages, people know I'm a professional storyteller, but there was a spin, there was a story that justified the existence of those things. I mean, you know, we were a nation that was founded in the idea of freedom, equality, direct citizen participation, and yet from the very start, a huge segment of the population wasn't allowed to vote, wasn't allowed to participate as citizens, didn't enjoy equality. So some sort of justification had to be given for that. And there was a very strong story at the time. And in those early forms of racialized control, it was a racialized story where, you know, the story that was told was, these people have no souls, these people are worthless, these people are this and this, and they're inferior stock, et cetera, et cetera. A very racialized story was told in the beginning, but slowly, as we went through more advances and changed the society, and especially following the civil rights movement, when it became no longer socially acceptable to condemn people on the basis of race, a new story had to be spun. And so there was a new justification that came out for the new Jim Crow, for mass incarceration, which was that we want to get tough on crime. So if you could be criminalized, if you could be assigned the label of criminal, and let's say if your image could be cemented to a criminal label, then all that opens the doors for all these other things. So it's nothing new. It's just a different form.
But she also talks about the fact that the war on drugs hasn't been fought in the white neighborhoods. So we haven't seen people, SWAT teams, rappelling into our neighborhoods and, you know, storming through houses and looking in all the drawers for drugs, because she puts the statistics out there too that really the use and sales of drugs are basically the same. But it's the African American people whose neighborhoods get raided, and therefore they're the ones who then are charged with possession and then become part of the penal system.
Right. And let's talk about that. You know, she mentions 1982, Ronald Reagan initiates this war on drugs, and then the crack endemic happens within LA and then spreads to other urban cities around the country. So the war is initiated before the actual problem occurs, which is sort of ironic, don't you think?
Yes.
Normally when something happens, it's something that happens, and then a war is initiated in response to that. And this was the total opposite. And that this war was waged primarily in communities of color, poor communities of color. And so when we're looking at, okay, this war is waged in poor communities of color, why? Why was this war on drugs waged? And Laron, I think I'm going to come to you. You know, she's focusing on this war on drugs. We can say, okay, we realize that, but what was the reason for why?
Yeah. Well, actually, again, that isn't the first time something like that has happened. I mean, you know, after slavery, there was, and there were advances that were gained by the people who had been enslaved. There was a change in society, and those people who had an investment in maintaining racial hierarchy needed to do something to make sure that they stayed on the top. So in Michelle Alexander's words, they triggered a collapse of resistance across the political spectrum. And that same technique, same method has been used recently, trigger a collapse of resistance across the political spectrum. So after the gains of the civil rights movement, the gains of the civil rights era, those who were invested in maintaining racial hierarchy sought to trigger that same sort of collapse. Mm-hmm. And they did it not just to maintain the kind of economic power, but also political power. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Ronald Reagan earlier. They came up with a brilliant idea. There's a quote in there, I forget who said it, but the quote was that they needed to find some way to control or to not to mention race, but to control the racialized population.
Right. And when you look at now, we have you had a huge amount of poor whites that the Republicans wanted to bring into their party and to have them, you know, to achieve their goal, to win their votes rather. And this was a way for them to do that, and it worked beautifully, unfortunately.
And also she says in here that bottom line, it was easier to go into poor neighborhoods of color because if you went into the white neighborhoods and started searching all the kids, that you would likely run into political power that would make a big stink about that. And so that's the targeting of poor people without the political power to fight it.
So we're going to jump to this notion of silence and denial around issues that we face within our society. And Alexander says, when the system of mass incarceration collapses, and if history is any guide, it will, historians will undoubtedly look back and marvel that such an extraordinarily comprehensive system of racialized social control existed in the United States. How fascinating, they will say, that a drug war was waged almost exclusively against poor people of color, people already trapped in ghettos that lacked jobs and decent schools. They were rounded up by the millions, packed away in prisons, and when released, they were stigmatized for life, denied the right to vote, and ushered into a world of discrimination, legally barred from employment, housing, and welfare benefits, and saddled with thousands of dollars of debt. These families were shamed and condemned for failing to hold together their families. They were chastised for succumbing to depression and anger, and blamed for landing back in prisons. Historians will likely wonder how we could describe the new caste system as a system of crime control, when it is a system better designed to create rather than prevent crime. So Cassie, I want to come back to this notion of like denial and silence. But if we were able to sleep through this creation of mass incarceration in 30 years, from 300,000 to 2 million now, could it be that we're sleeping through some other very deeply entrenched racialized control systems? And if so, why? Is it based on silence, denial, apathy? What are your thoughts?
I think that it's definitely possible. I'm sure that the way that, just as in slavery, white indentured servants were kept from African American slaves, just in the same way now that the issue of incarceration divides people that lack political and social and economic power along the lines of race, so that we sort of can't address this problem. So it ends up, I think the rhetoric teaches poor white communities that they have something to gain from incarceration. I think it teaches white people more generally that they have something to gain, that we have something to gain from keeping our racial power. And yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if that.
What are your thoughts, Barbara, about that? Do you think this system of racialized, this racialized control system, mass incarceration, was sort of on our radar, but we weren't deeply aware of it until we kind of got deeper within the book? What are your thoughts about other systems that could be similar to mass incarceration and having such detrimental effects?
Well, I believe that my African American students, for example, are much more aware of this trend than my white students or white adults. And I think that has to have an effect on them and how they see their future and how education works or doesn't work for them. And of course, in education, we have come to be aware of the achievement gap or the education gap, that we are not succeeding with a predictable community of students. And so we are trying to find out the answers to that, but I'm sure there are lots more of those realities that we just don't see.
And I want to come to this notion of color blindness, because Alexander says our blindness prevents us from seeing how mass incarceration most largely affects black and brown men, but also from seeing the racial and structural divisions that persist in society, the segregated unequal schools, the segregated jobless ghettos, and the segregated public discourse, a public conversation that excludes the current pariah caste. And when I think about the notion of this war being waged within poor communities of color against primarily African American young men, and she mentioned some urban cities like Washington, D.C., in which almost 3 out of 5 of the young men are going to have some type of engagement with this system. Here we're looking at Ann Arbor here. So what is it that we're thinking about this colorblind? We obviously see that the war on drugs was not colorblind. It's nice to say we're all, let's hold hands, we're all together, we're all just very, alike, we're all humans. But colorblindness actually is very detrimental to the movement. So LaRon, going forward, how do you think we need to address this issue of colorblindness in creating a movement that's going to work for us?
Yeah, I think that we see the effects of the war on drugs. We see the effects of racial hierarchy in 1,000 different ways. But earlier I talked about stories. And we're given a story that explains why those things look the way they do. I mean, even in here, she says that there's an explanation for this war on drugs, for the mass incarceration rates. And the explanation is that there's a lot of criminal activity and we want to control the criminal activity. Mm-hmm. We're not told the larger story about how the whole war on drugs was created. We're not told the larger story about how communities are targeted. We're not told again, I'm a big proponent of helping people to see historical context, we're not given any sort of context for understanding the rest of that stuff. So if you can get somebody to say, we are ignoring color, this is not an issue of color, if you can convince us that that's true, then we stop looking for it. And we start looking instead for the criminal aspect of it. And a lot of people do believe that these huge, astonishing numbers are the result of simply getting tough on crime, and that there's a lot of crime in those communities of color that we need to control for.
And Alexander surely shows us that the statistics did not equate to that assumption.
Right.
So we're looking at moving forward, and we're talking about ways that we can move forward in society. And Alexander says that we need to call on people of conviction and faith to build a movement that provides a moral force to begin to dismantle racial caste systems as a whole, not just mass incarceration. Because if you dismantle mass incarceration and do not look at the whole system and the whole creation of these systems, then it will just be replaced with something else. So students organizing against prisons, I know you all have a couple of things going on, and we have just about 2 minutes. So I want you to take just 30 seconds and let us know what you guys are doing to move forward in eradicating mass incarceration.
So yeah, our group is relatively new. We've only really been doing work for about a year, but I think our goal and what we're moving towards is to be supporting people who work in education, people who work in housing, people who work in the political realm of our area, to support efforts to that sort of are already going on, and to take the time that we have as students and to take the resources that we have access to as students at the University of Michigan to continue both like educating ourselves and educating, making sure that the conversation that Michelle Alexander really starts in this book or continues in this book, that there's a space for that on campus, but also trying to put that into action on a very local level, seeing what actions are already being taken and trying to support those.
Well, we want to support you all within your efforts as well. We talked about the Understanding Race Project, all the programs and things that are going to be occurring, and we realize that although the project is from January through June of 2013, that's not the end, right? It's going to go much further than that. Barbara, you're in education. You have about 30 seconds to let us know what you want to do within your sphere of influence.
Well, I think the discussions, the actual dialogues that can be happening within the community are hugely important. And I also think I learned from reading her book more about Martin Luther King, and that he wanted to change from this just civil rights to human rights with his poor people's movement in 1968. So if the education system can also get beyond the I Have a Dream speech and study more of his works, that would be enlightening for everyone.
Laron, 10 seconds.
Join us January 22nd. The Racial and the Economic Justice Task Force of the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice is initiating a book study around the same book, January 22nd, at St. Aidan's Church on the ground level.
Beautiful. So what I think all of us want to say is that this is not an issue that we're going to solve overnight, but it's important and it's incumbent upon all of us to get involved within our own sphere of influences, within our own communities, within our own faith-based groups, within our own families, and to do whatever we can do in order to raise the level of consciousness around mass incarceration and racial caste systems as a whole. So we are inviting all of you all to be engaged within the Understanding Race Project. There are several community conversations that are occurring on a monthly basis. There are tons of conversations and dialogues that are going to be occurring through the Ann Arbor IFSI Reads. You can get more information on that on the website. And don't let it stop there. Have a conversation, let it seep into your soul deeply, and then move forward. Get involved in doing something else. So again, my name is Zarina Elamine Naeem, and I thank you all, thank our panelists for joining with us today. And we thank Alexander for writing the book,
Yes.
for forcing us to address that issue. And we're looking forward to going forward. Thank you all. Good evening.